Our most important job is to keep Americans safe. The United States continues to lead a global coalition in our mission to destroy ISIL. ISIL's already lost about 40% of the populated areas it once controlled in Iraq, and it's losing territory in Syria.
President Obama at his end-of-the-year pre-vacation press conference touting progress against ISIS, a comment which stands very much in contrast to a tape-recorded message from ISIS leader al-Baghdadi released just yesterday, in which he maintains that the Russian and U.S.-led coalition airstrikes against ISIS are having very little effect. And we're now back with the panel. Steve, your observations.
Well, that wasn't the only thing that was in contrast between President Obama's message and al-Baghdadi's message. You remember, if you listen carefully to what the president has said over the past several weeks, you would think that Guantanamo and closing Guantanamo is a key priority for the president and is a key magnet, as he said it, for ISIS. It was never mentioned at any time in the 24-minute audio tape that al-Baghdadi released. It's never been a key component of ISIS or al-Qaeda propaganda, and yet the president is insisting on moving forward and closing it. Look, I think we've made some progress by all accounts in Ramadi. I hope Ramadi turns out well, but I think the way that the U.S. and its coalition is taking Ramadi will virtually ensure that at whatever short-term gains we have, there won't be long-term consolidation of those gains, primarily because we're relying once again on the Iranian PMUs, the Popular Mobilization Units, and Iranian Shiite militias, Shiite militias, that will exacerbate the sectarian tensions. You have Ramadi, the capital of the Anbar province, the heart of the surge. And the reason the surge worked was because we worked with Sunnis and we neutralized Shiite militias. This time around, we're taking on the Sunnis, the local Sunnis, in addition to ISIS, and in many cases, we're working with the Shiite militias. So huge contrasts.
To be sure, whoever inherits Mr. Obama's job, the next president will inherit all of these problems with the global war on terrorism, and they're all speaking about it to some degree or another. Let's take a look at a montage of various perspectives.
I do not believe that we should again have 100,000 American troops in combat in the Middle East. That is just not the smart move to make here.
We will have a president who will make clear we will utterly destroy ISIS. We will carpet bomb them into oblivion.
It would be so great if we could get Russia on our side and other countries on our side and knock the hell out of ISIS, just knock the living hell out of them.
Well, it's unfair to diminish their perspective on this to just those sound bites, with possible exception of Trump. But what's lacking in almost all these candidate responses to waging the war on terrorism is assuming ISIS is ultimately defeated. What replaces it? Just as ISIS filled the vacuum left by the U.S. departure from Iraq in 2011, who fills the next vacuum created by the defeat of ISIS? And this is something that nobody's really touching in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that the Islamic State teaches us is that something always does fill the vacuums. It is itself an outgrowth of al-Qaeda, which had, its origins, as you say, in many respects, and in the early days of the U.S. intervention in Iraq. Something always leads to something else. Certainly, what I think we heard from Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is the voice of a would-be wartime leader. He is trying to be a battlefield general in that address, and the timing of the address is interesting because he had suffered a few battlefield reversals, and he's trying to rally the troops and essentially respond to the combination of threats he now faces, which are primarily from the United States and Russia. At one time, he might have thought that Russia would be, if not a friend, at least a benign force for him, and that hasn't turned out to be the case at all. So I think there's one thing that we'll have to see among the political candidates is how well they address that question. What is your long-term strategy for what's behind this movement, for what's basically allowing one thing to flow from another? And how does the United States position itself to not look like the enemy, not look like it's exacerbating the problem in the Middle East, and is actually there to try to be a force for good?
Just first of all, just to put the terrorism threat in perspective, the year after 9/11, 2002, there are 1,000 terrorist attacks worldwide. This past year, there were 30,000 terrorist attacks. And of course, we see them from groups not just ISIS and al-Qaeda, we see them throughout North Africa and other places. So it's a worldwide global threat. So I think this president would do well not to once again downplay that threat. The Baghdadi comments I found particularly interesting in that Baghdadi was also targeting Saudi Arabia for its false brand of Islam. Why? Saudi Arabia has actually put together a 34-member nation coalition to go after ISIS. The kingdom where a lot of the extremism that fuels ISIS has come from now feels like ISIS is an existential threat. There have been terrorist ISIS attacks within Saudi Arabia, but I do think this is going to become a key component of defeating ISIS in the end.
Muslims make up something like, I think, 1/4 of the world's population. And even if only a tiny, tiny fraction of them are radicals or jihadists, it points to thousands upon thousands of terrorist attacks. Is Islam in need of a reformation, of the like that Christianity underwent hundreds of years ago?
Doug, what's the old saying that all that is necessary for evil to prevail is for good men and women to do nothing? So if we're going to defeat this in the long run, we've got to have the reformation you talked about within Islam so that the law-abiding, peaceful, constructive Muslims step up and say, this is not the face of our religion, because those of us who are not Muslims don't have credibility in that part of the world. So it's going to have to come, it's going to have to be indigenous and authentic to them to reform these societies in a way that gives these young, radicalized young people some hope for the future. Better economies, a political system that gives them some outlet for their aspirations and so forth. And it's just not happening enough right now.
That's the carrot approach. Does a stick approach help in this effort?
Absolutely. These sound bites you played are interesting. In the short run, we have homicidal terrorists who have to kill us all. Every one of our viewers today, they would gladly kill. We only have one alternative, and that's to stop them. And if we have to kill them first, we have to do that. But in the long run, every expert will tell you, we're not going to kill our way out of this problem. We've got to try and deal with the root causes of the problem, ultimately, if we're going to prevail. Regrettably, that's a generational undertaking.
Well, you do have to do a lot of killing your way out of it, but Muslims are also victims of these terror attacks. You think about the terror attacks on the school in Pakistan, those children being shot, 132 of them. You think about the attack on Beirut just days before the Paris attack, a suicide bomber. Those were all Muslims killed. I mean, this is a point that Muslim leaders need to bring to the Muslim population over and over again.
And this is why I think Donald Trump's comments were so hurtful. I mean, you know, it's been exaggerated. It's not the case that ISIS is using this as propaganda regularly, as Hillary Clinton says. At the same time, the entire long-term strategy of reformation inside the Muslim world has to be based on separating moderate Muslims from the radicals. And this makes that job all the more difficult. And there are many moderate Muslims. I mean, I've talked to moderate Muslims here in the United States. When you cover intelligence and national security, some of the very best people you talk to are moderate Muslims who are working on our behalf in the war on terror. So it's not helpful at all to paint them all with a broad brush.
If this war is multi-generational, we've seen how Americans are willing to accept some intrusions into their privacy, examination of metadata for some extent. But if you have a generational war against radical Islam, that is a de facto permanent intrusion into our civil liberties. Is America willing to accept that?
I think yes, on an expanding and contracting basis. We're willing to accept it when the threat appears to be most acute, less willing to accept it when the threat appears remote.
30 seconds, Senator.
It's one of the dilemmas a free society faces in an age of suicidal terror. We have to preserve the values that make us as Americans exceptional, but at the same time, the ultimate denial of one's individual liberties is when they're killed. Final thing I'll say is, we can't let someone like Edward Snowden define how we protect America. Our government is not as great a threat to the American people as suicidal terrorists. We need to focus on them.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you, panel. We'll see you next Sunday.